Yes, so I think I'm going to start. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Carmen Maldonado, and I am professor and chair of the Department of Biology here at the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras. And I want to welcome you to the beginning of our Neuroscience and Society series that is sponsored by the Neuro-ID program. And as part of our community of the BP and DUR programs across the US. And it's my pleasure to be here and be able to talk to you about topics that really intersect neuroscience and society. And today I'm meeting with my students here at the Neuro-ID program. You cannot see them, but maybe I can. So girls, and you can say hi. Hi. They're here. And I only have, we can just introduce ourselves since there's two joining us. Yuval, how do you pronounce your last name, Yuval?
Vanguera.
Vanguera. Guerra. Okay,
Yes.
Yuval. Yes, and you said you were at, are you at Vanderbilt?
Yeah, for the summer, but I'm a Hunter College student.
Oh, okay.
In New York.
And okay, and you are in what, are you a sophomore, junior?
Rising senior.
Rising senior, muy bien. And Mariel?
Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
I'm from California, University of California, San Diego.
Huh? And you're doing your summer at?
At the Salk Institute in La Jolla.
Oh, so this is very early for you.
Yes. Yeah, but yeah.
I really appreciate you waking up early then to be here. Thank you,
Yeah,
Maria.
of course.
Okay, so I guess it's going to be a small group. Nevertheless, this is recorded, so it will be for the, you know, the opportunity for others that were not able to join us to just see it later at our website. So, but in any event, today we're going to talk about the impact of the coronavirus on the nervous system, its effects on mental health and society. And of course, let me see if I can. You know, our presentation is originated here at the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras. And I bring up this image because basically the pandemic has touched everyone in the globe. And in Puerto Rico in particular, we as a, you know, as a country that has confronted many disasters, the pandemic has also been another major challenge for us from the mental health point of view. And therefore, we have changed when you go into looking at our statistics, and that could be happening either of your home institutions as well. But if you look at our data from last year, we see that in the only a year ago, 27% of Puerto Rico in general was vaccinated, but now a year later, 87% are fully vaccinated. So that tells you of a change of how public health have addressed the importance of vaccination. But we still have a very high positivity rate right now. In Puerto Rico, our test positivity rate as yesterday, which is when I took these numbers, is pretty high. So that means that the community transmission of the virus is quite healthy going around in us. So I'm talking with you without a mask, but all my students that you just saw were wearing a mask because this is one of the mandates that we have here in the institution. And the change of our attitude toward the virus, of course, has come to a point where we see it from a different perspective, and our behavior changes from what it was a year ago from what it is now. Nevertheless, we think that there's so much to understand how is the virus affecting our behavior and affecting our society, that it continues to be a source of lots of research and understanding in order to eventually come out of this pandemic. And another very important thing that we should also address is what is considered to be an issue that not only pertains COVID-19, but it has happened in other health crisis, is that sometimes a lot of health related issues confront themselves with racial disparity and implicit bias. And COVID-19 has not been an exception. In particular, when we look at the situation that people of color, African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans in the United States, and we can talk about here in Puerto Rico, but from other perspectives, they have been confronted with major challenges to address the issue of their health. And COVID has made it quite an obvious situation. For example, it is known that African Americans contract the disease much higher than white individuals, nearly twice as much in the United States, and Hispanics and Indian and Alaska Natives are also overrepresented. And because of the way the health system at this moment in the majority of the centers in the United States has created some inequities that enables this community to get healthcare, and therefore goes to this disadvantage of having access to good healthcare in order for them to understand why is it important to take care when you are facing COVID. And also another argument, very important, that is associated to this disparity is that there's a higher incidence and prevalence and comorbidity conditions that we all know make COVID worse, which is obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease in these communities. And therefore, facing and discussing these issues is extremely important for us to understand why COVID continues to be part of a major health problem in the United States and in Puerto Rico. The other thing is that there's a lot of social and behavioral issues related to why these communities get more transmitted the disease. First of all, the majority of this community, it could be uninsured, therefore they don't have health insurance, therefore they don't know where to get the support they need when they were sick. More likely they work on service industry, so they are exposed to other people. You know, they don't have the luxury of staying home and say, okay, I'll work from home or things like that. They live in housing situations that they cannot keep distance between each one because, you know, all the families together, you don't have the luxury to say, okay, I'm staying in my room. Everybody else, can you share your room with 3 of your siblings? That is very hard. So social distancing and isolating is very difficult. And also, like I just mentioned, working in jobs that are not amendable for teleworking, you know, like I'll stay home and work. No, you have to go to work. And so those are behavioral and societal and economic issues that also put this whole community at risk. So these are something that, these are matters that are very important to discuss, things that we should be aware of, because now that I'm going to talk to you about the physiology and the effect of COVID into the brain, you will see that this will have an important impact on this community. And therefore, we all should be very conscientious of helping and understanding how we should improve the livelihood and the healthcare of all of us. Okay. So there's at the beginning of the pandemic and the way science was basically, I have to tell you that it has been amazing on how fast research has evolved with the pandemic because COVID-19 showed up and we had no idea what was going on, where were the mechanisms of action. Creating a vaccine in a year is the most amazing thing that we as scientists have achieved, because vaccinations will take at least 5-7 years to come to the market, with research that takes years as well. So the high speed of development of understanding how this virus affects us was very much present in the scientific community. But then again, with that, we found that the virus not only affects the respiratory system, but it also affects the brain. And most definitely it goes inside the brain. And the question here says, does the virus invade the brain? And the answer is yes. So how does that happen? If you have read a little bit about how COVID works, you will see that COVID is SARS-CoV-2, which is the name of the virus, is surrounded by this called the spike protein. Remember, it's a retrovirus, so it's a virus that will attach to the RNA, not to the DNA. Remember, it's an RNA virus. And the spike protein has a receptor in most cells of the body. In particular, the receptor is called the AC2 receptor. So once SARS-CoV-2, this spike protein recognizes the AC2 receptor, is going to be able to, in the membrane of the cell, be able to enter the cell. And that's how the virus enters cells in general. And what happens is that when the virus is in the cells, it will elicit an inflammation. So that chronic inflammation will go into the lungs and will create the fever, the cough, and all the other symptomatology that we understand is the COVID-19, that is much like a flu, but in full force, right? We all know that, okay. But the interesting thing is that AC2 regulates cardiovascular function in human organs, including the lung, the heart, the kidney, the intestine, and the brain tissue. So as you see, once you are infected with COVID, COVID goes everywhere that can get into, okay? And the virus is known, research has found that the virus goes into the vein through your nose, okay? So that's why we're wearing our masks, and that's why it's so important to wear masks, because you're protecting the entry of the virus into your body. So, and also the other way it goes is through your gut. So that's why the mouth and nose have to be protected, because there's a major expression of the human AC2 receptors in these organs. So also it has found that the presence of COVID in the brain would elicit certain symptomatology that the first thing it will include is because it goes through the nose, and if it goes to the gut, it had got to go through the mouth. What do you think the two senses that will get affected will be? The taste and the smell. Those were the two triggering symptomatology that made the researchers decide, okay, the virus is going through the nervous system that controls both these senses. So that was one of our key elements for us to respond and examine what was going on. So anosmia is a lack of smell, and aheusia is the lack of taste, okay? So you will see that those two things kind of like make you think that you will have COVID. Therefore, it indicates a narrow invasive nature of the virus. So the virus, as has neurological manifestations, once it's inside the brain, it brings the mild manifestation is what I just told you, lack of taste and lack of smell. But it also can, in a moderate situation, create twitching and seizures, as well as when it's severe, encephalopathy. We can have also the acute respiratory distress syndrome and the hypercytokinemia, which is the cytokine storm that a lot of people have associated with the inflammation exposed to COVID. Very interesting as well is that there is a correlation between the AC2 receptor and the nicotine receptor. The nicotine receptor is a receptor that we have inside the brain and also in the periphery. It is very important for the neuromuscular junction, but also for interactions with the acetyl system that allows you to deal with memory. It's also functioning for reward systems, because nicotine, does it sound familiar? What is nicotine? Anybody heard nicotine? That is in the cigarettes, right? So nicotine addiction, which is when you're smoking, you're addicted to smoking, is because you have an overexpression of nicotine receptors in the brain due to chronic exposure to cigarettes. So if there's a connection between the receptor that is allowing the virus to enter, and you have nicotine receptors regulating AC2 action, what do you think is going to happen? That people that smoke are more vulnerable to COVID than others because of this simple behavioral response of these people that have nicotine addiction, for example. So smoking is a risk factor. Age, we all know that people older than 65 are in high risk. Genetic susceptibilities of individuals, mutations in endemic strains, this has also been found, and individual with prevailing neuronal alignment, such as epilepsy, multiple sclerosis, and then on other neurological pathologies. Oops. Doesn't want to pass. So, like I mentioned, the loss of smell and taste hint that COVID can target the nervous system. How does it do that? Well, very interesting. So, this is a very smart virus. Let's just say that. Because as I told you, it has a way to enter the endothelial cells very easily. And the brain, as you know, has something that protects it. It is called the blood-brain barrier, right? But it says blood, right? So blood is constituted of endothelial cells that the virus is able to enter. The way it does, as I just mentioned with the AC receptor, opens and creates this pocket where it enters the bloodstream. And when it enters the bloodstream, of course, there will be a reaction because it's a virus. So it will be a reaction of your body to create inflammation. That inflammation is going to increase what is called the microthrombus formation. The thrombosis is more like a stroke. And so what it happens is that it's going to attack the vascular system of the brain, and it's going to create inflammation, the microthrombus, coagulation, it wants to coagulate the blood. Therefore, you don't want a clot in your brain either, right? So that is also fibrin deposition, platelet activation. You know, the platelets are very important in a infection. So if there's a lot of platelets, it also shows that the body is trying to attack this foreign thing that is affecting us. And that will in turn create the neuroinflammation and the cytokine storm with all these interleukin response that the immune system has. And that also is very important, that the presence of this cytokine storm will activate the microglia that we all know these are cells that are responding in the immune system, and the ones that swell when there's an impact of the brain. The microglia swells, so it protects the neurons in order to do the control, the damage control, what's happening. The problem of the matter is that when microglia gets activated, it alters neurotransmitter, neurotransmission, and it may, in some cases, induce neurological damage. In particular, because they have been shown that there's an increase on glutamate and upregulation of NMDA receptors. Glutamate is the excitatory amino acid in the brain that is extremely important for excitation of the cell. But when you have it too much excitation, it can go into the wrong way. It can go into exocytosis. And exocytosis will induce apoptosis, which is cell death, and then you have death of neurons happening. So the other interesting thing that it does, and still the mechanism is not known, then there is depletion of certain neurotransmitters such as serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. For those of you who don't know this, but loss of these three neurotransmitters, which are called the monoamines, loss of these concentration of these neurotransmitters in the brain are associated with depression, anxiety, and other emotional dysfunction. Therefore, as you can see in what we're going to discuss today, the COVID has a significant impact in the function of the brain. Okay, but I want, we'll see. But I want to stress something that is just recently being discovered. At the beginning, we thought that it's the COVID that is doing all this. But when you look at CSF or cerebrospinal fluid on postmortem patients that have died of COVID, we see there's very little COVID in the cerebrospinal fluid. So it's not really that you have an infection of the brain that is just corona doing that. It's what corona does to the inflammation, the immune system. It's basically after corona is there, they leave, but then whatever they did there is what induces the effect. So it's not that corona is actually making that is all when you open the brain is full with corona. No, in fact, there's almost non-corona when you have a postmortem. So that's a very interesting finding that takes us to understand that basically is more what it does in the neuroimmune system than what it happens with but while the COVID is in the brain, it obviously runs amok, and we see that. Okay. So first, cytokines and microglia activation lead to neurotoxicity. I just mentioned patients with severe COVID infections have reported the severe cytokine storm, which increases pro-inflammatory tumor necrosis factor, the TNF-alpha. After that, the presence of TNF-alpha can directly cross the blood-brain barrier and induce cytokine damage or CVOs. Once it's crossed the blood-brain barrier, cytokines activate microglia and astrocytes, and activation of microglia secretes inflammatory mediators, including glutamate and all. This is more like a summary of what I just showed you in the image. And then higher glutamate, higher upregulation on MDA receptors, induce altered learning, memory, neuroplasticity, hallucinations, and nightmares. Patients with COVID have complained about the fog brain. They have complained about delirium. They have complained about being hallucinating while they have COVID, okay? So these are all reasons why we should understand that the COVID is affecting the brain directly. And as I mentioned to you, this is also a way so you can see that the infected leukocytes, what happens is that because of the inflammation, the blood-brain barrier opens and makes these little gaps where then you have the infected leukocytes entering the brain and making the problems that we just discussed. So as you can see, the coronavirus enters inside an infected leukocyte, okay? Another important thing is that it doesn't discriminate. Thus far, they have been able to identify the areas where areas where the brain expresses AC2 receptors that I told you is the internal receptor for coronavirus. There's a lot of AC2 receptors in the motor cortex, also in the posterior cingulate cortex, the ventricles, also in the substantia nigra, that is a group of cells that originate in the midbrain and contains dopamine, for example, that regulates motor response. You have everything that goes into the middle temporal gyrus, which is involved with the hippocampus and the amygdala, things that are related to learning and memory and emotions. And also very interesting, it is also localized here at the ventrolateral medulla, where you have the nucleus tractus solitarius and the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is a cranial nerve that controls all our internal organs. Therefore, what we know is that, and in addition to the neurons, you can find AC2 receptors in neurons, microglia, astrocytes, and oligodendrocytes, you see? So everywhere it can connect. And the interesting thing is that you see it has the spike, those spike protein will attach to AC2 neurons wherever it is, right? So why I mentioned to you this group here on the pons, the vagus nerve, but also these are the pontine respiratory group and the dorsal respiratory group of neurons. These are group of neurons at the level of the brainstem that projects and control the information of the lungs, okay? And everything that has to do with the movement of your lungs and the control from the nervous system. What we know is that when COVID enters through your lungs, right? It will go to your heart, of course, and that's one of the first most dramatic effects that COVID has. But the thing is that the virus may also circulate through the blood, then attack the ACE2 receptors in the blood-brain barrier and invading neurons coming from the lungs, because there's a neuronal connection from the lungs to the brain. So what we know is that it's a retrograde connection. It's coming from the postsynaptic cells, that is from the organs, to cells that go into the brain. So when you inhale the COVID goes through your olfactory nerve and your olfactory epithelium, no? And that, which is here. And what you see is that the COVID, through exocytosis, which is a regular process that happens in the neurons, which are vesiculated, they will come out in a retrograde fashion and then attack the presynaptic cell, which is the one that connects into your brain. And that's how from periphery to central, this virus travels. So it's a very interesting way of, and very strategic way of getting the virus inside your brain, which is terrible, but that's how it is. This is a very smart virus. So we know that the virus penetrates the olfactory mucosa, causing loss of smell, I just mentioned. And also it passes in a blood-brain barrier, creates inflammatory cytokines, induces instability, etc. The other thing is that it could be reached via the circumventricular organs, the CVOs. These are midline structures around the third and fourth ventricle that monitor blood and cerebrospinal fluid within the blood-brain barrier. So what happens is that that's how COVID goes into the cerebrospinal fluid, through these organs, the CVOs, okay? So it's interesting because the CVOs are also very much controlling a response to nausea and the smell and lack of taste, because of when there is a viral infection of the CVOs. Other short and long-term neuropsychiatric symptoms are more likely due to that neuroinflammatory and hypoxic injury, due to the fact that if there is inflammation, thrombosis, what happens is that there's not going to be oxygen or glucose coming to those neurons, and therefore you have cell death, and therefore you have stroke, okay? So that's one of the situations that COVID also affects that through the olfactory bulb. And experiments from mice also suggest that the virus might target nervous system through the olfactory bulb. The olfactory bulb is an area of the brain that is very much involved with everything that has to do with the olfactory system. So for example, there was a I think it's just because there's no movement here. Yeah, there you go. Sorry, it's the room. What they found is that this in animal models, they found the entry of the SARS-CoV go through to the brain goes through the olfactory bulb. So the virus then rapidly spreads in connecting nerves, and the extensive nerve damage was major cause of death. And even though when there was low levels of the virus in the brain at the end on postmortem. So again, I mentioned to you, it's just when they get there, they do their damage, and then they release and go somewhere else to do another damage. So it's very, very dangerous. So here you see, we get the COVID through your nose. It goes to the olfactory bulb. In the olfactory bulb, it has to cross the blood-brain barrier. Once it crosses the blood-brain barrier, of course, then from one cell to the another through retrograde signaling, it will go 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. And then everywhere that there's cells with AC2 receptors, it will get there. And it's important to mention that it also, through the cerebrospinal fluid, it can affect the spinal cord as well, because just as the brain, the spinal cord is part of the nervous system, the central nervous system. Sí, yes. Está bien, dime.
Cuando ocurre esto de la transferencia
See, the astrocytes are in this, remember, astrocytes are around the cell, the neuron, and in the synapse, it maintains a stability of the synapse to be happening. So the astrocytes are in constant interaction with the neurons there. And so you can get, because AC2 is also in astrocytes, you can get coronavirus from the astrocytes, from the neurons. So it's not only the neurons, it's also the astrocytes interacting with the presence of COVID. Yes. No, that's not that we know of yet, as of yet. Okay. So the neurological manifestations of COVID include headache, I said, nausea, algenia, stroke, impairment of consciousness, coma, seizure, and encephalopathy. These are all things that can happen with people with COVID. Obviously, the people they call the long haulers, which is the long COVID that we'll discuss at the end of the talk, or who often had mild or moderate COVID symptoms early in the disease, have reported experiencing the brain fog, which is crushing fatigue and other neurological system for months after they were infected. And we'll talk about that later. So other conditions that are for people that suffer from multiple sclerosis, neuromuscular disorders, epilepsies, these are prone to be very in high risk if you get COVID, okay? So the symptoms I mentioned, there's gonna be neuroinflammation, encephalopathy, there's gonna be cytokine storm, there's going to be stroke, and smokers, like I mentioned, the nicotine receptor AC2 have a very much susceptibility to getting a worse COVID than others. Another phenomenon that occurs is delirium. Delirium is when people start hallucinating. And so that has happened with people with COVID. Some people have been hyperdelirium. That means that they may get a psychotic episode, but as the jury's out on whether being hospitalized for long could be the reason why you're delirious, or the COVID itself. So there's still analysis of that data, but certainly there is presence of delirium over COVID. And delirium have detrimental consequences, because hospitals have said that people that suffer from delirium will be susceptible for depression later. And since I mentioned to you that COVID can reduce neurotransmitters related to emotional processes, it wouldn't surprise me that these patients will also be susceptible for depression. And previously healthy older patients with delirium can develop dementia. So dementia can also be a sequel of COVID if, obviously, depending on how much it was impacted in your brain. Yes. It determines the impact of the brain, determines on what I mentioned to you, the risk factors, your genetics, your social situation, many. It's very complex, and we'll talk about treating people with COVID in long COVID. That has become a very challenging situation for physicians. This is a paper that was published last year, where you see, we always talk about COVID affecting just the older group of people, but young children and adolescents in the United States have found to have also been impacted by COVID. In particular, in this case, you have cases where you have through MRI, encephalitis, severe encephalitis, thrombosis, Guillain-Barré, and other anomalies in the brain of young people that have been affected by COVID. So what I'm trying to convey is that there is also evidence that COVID can affect the developing brain. And that in a recent study of 1695 patients, 25 or younger, hospitalized, 22% of them had neurological involvement. And also they had numbers that are quite considering. So what I'm trying to convey is that the COVID will impact the brain no matter what age. So that's why we all should be protecting ourselves from this condition, no matter if you're young, because the argument is, the young are fine. You get COVID. And you see, there is data that can show that that developing brain that that continues to develop until you're 21 is still vulnerable to changes if COVID affects you. Another interesting thing, and this has more to do more from the standpoint of research projects, is that the virus can infect human brain organoids. Human brain organoids are basically models of neurons that they are artificially developed. And that shows that these human organoids brain organoids can be infected and replicated by COVID, which is important that it happens, because then we can do a lot of research about how to counterattack this infection in these models, artificial models. And that is interesting because this makes it more simplified to study the effects of COVID in the brain using this tissue. And but we want to, I want to clarify that these human brain organoids are not, I mean, they mimic what you will be in a neuron, but they don't have glial cells. They don't have all the other infrastructure that is in the brain that we all know is also affecting the scenario. Nevertheless, and then also this human, another, let's say, limitation is that they don't have a blood-brain barrier as well. So that also is more of an artificial scenario that will be more like a simplified way of understanding how the virus affects the brain. But it's important to know that these are possibilities of studying the impact of coronavirus in the brain. And like I mentioned to you, that some examination of brains in an autopsy of people with COVID have discovered only low levels of the viral RNA transcripts. And so what we don't know really is why is it that not staying in the brain, but the impact is so dramatic. So that is something that remains to be studied. And also, it's important to know that the AC2 proteins are expressed in the human brain organoids. So that's why the brain, this model allows the COVID to enter the cells. So it's very interesting to see how we can mimic what is happening inside the brain, but in a very limited way, but it's still an interesting focus for many studies. Right, so I just, we talked a little bit about the physiology, and now I want to talk more about the behavior. Well, what is COVID doing in with regards to our behavior and our mental health? And I want to focus that on you guys, right? And on college students, because for the last 2 years, almost 3 years now, you guys have been targeted by the pandemic, I would say, in so many ways. Because we had to come up with ideas to keeping you a normalcy of educational system that allowed you to maintain, continue your agenda of studying, finishing college, etc. But what has happened is that you remember 2 years ago, everybody went online. We were all online with a computer, and Was it a nice experience? No, it was terrible experience. It was an experience where everybody was very, very stressed out, right? And so data has come to show that the impact of the pandemic on mental health in college students has been dramatic. In particular, young people run although you guys don't get exposed to COVID as well. You don't, the high risk of getting the impact, yet the sequel of staying at home and not being to socialize, affecting your whole life, has elicited depression, anxiety, and suicide rates go up the roof through the pandemic due to the situation. For example, the bestcolleges.com survey showed that 95% of college students have experienced negative mental health symptoms as a result of COVID-19 related situations. Almost half of them believe mental health effects have directly affected their education, and nearly 97% said their lives outside the school have been impacted by the pandemic. And around 2 out of 5 students noted that it's been harder to meet classmates and make friends. So obviously, and I know from personal experience with both my sons are in college, and I know how hard it has been for them to maintain social interactions, and most of them, it has become things on the internet, But now, slowly but surely, we're getting back to some normalcy, but still not completely the same. There's a gender disparity here for the impact of COVID. It has known that women more than men have reported mental health effects in college students. Over a quarter of male students expect that mental health effects from COVID will not extend in long term, but women think, at least half of us think, that they will prolong, no? And students who experience social isolation or loneliness in the last year were especially likely to feel they were missing out on college experience. And 85% said pandemic-related circumstances have made it hard for them to meet new people. So these are dramatic numbers. It's not like whatever. It's something that impacted all of you in some way or the other. So the pandemic strains, which is the result of this infection, has increased anxiety and loneliness, almost 45% in that population, struggles with laziness, focus, and routine, loss of sleep. The way you guys sleep and relax is completely changed, and decreased physical activity and unhealthy eating. Of course, if you're sitting in front of a computer 8 hours a day, eating whatever is in the fridge, not doing exercise, chances are you're going to get, these problems as well. This is data that it was also collected. I just wanted to show you what students mentioned here. This is in the United States. So social isolation and loneliness was the highest number of percentage that they, reported. And also increased screen time. Of course, they were in front of the computer all the time because they had to study. So that was the highest, followed by increased time spending indoors, difficulty making friends. As you can see, the topics here, it affects the social and emotional development of a whole generation. And so these are matters that we should not take lightly. I think that these are issues that every educational system and healthcare system should be focusing as well. Okay. These are top 5 self-care activities: spending time doing a hobby. This is what they miss. Physical activity, spending time outdoors. Look at how much who consider the family part of their support system, their friends, their parents, their siblings, roommate, extended family. So these are the societal, impact of how you're going to manage this. They managed the pandemic. It needed their social network in order for them to survive. Without it, it would have been a situation of disaster. Okay. In Puerto Rico, at the beginning of the pandemic, at the UPR Humacao, which is another campus in our system, they did a study on understanding how students were experiencing the pandemic. And this is in Spanish, but I can translate. And what you see on the left is what was the, they call it it's an exercise where you see the word that was repeated most is the word that you will see with the biggest font. And what is the word here, girls? What is the word with the biggest font? Ansiedad, which is anxiety. That was everybody's in the word. Everything that they talk, anxiety came up. So when you look also on the right hand side, the emotional changes on changing from in-presence education to online education, the highest number was stress, followed by lack of concentration. So these were matters that would impact your behavior and educational performance due to the situation of changing your whole world from being in a classroom to being in your home with a computer in front of you with no one giving you feedback or anything. So that was a study that was done here in Puerto Rico with college students. So I just wanted to briefly mention to you a little bit about how social isolation affects the brain. And that is very important to understand why when they send us home, they say, oh, that's a way of fixing the problem. Well, in some regard it was, but in other regards, it just enhanced another problem, which is social isolation. Social isolation is one of the most impactful, detrimental thing you can do for your brain. Remember, we as a species, as humans, we are a social animal, therefore we need to socialize. And when you take us out of the socialization, it impacts your development as a species. So there's lots of data that shows that social isolation really is detrimental to the brain. Poor physical health, including obesity and cardiovascular programs, and a range of possible effects on the brain and have been documented in the pandemic. We all know, how the pandemic has affected us. But then if you add social isolation, it has been associated with increased risk of cognitive decline and dementia, as well as mental health consequences such as depression and anxiety. And there's several surveys already suggesting that many people have left increasing loneliness since COVID pandemic began. So there's all sorts of data, that MRI studies, imaging studies, animal models of social isolation that demonstrate that there are 3 areas of the brain that get really affected by social isolation. The first one is the prefrontal cortex, followed by the amygdala and the hippocampus. These 3 structures are extremely important for cognition and emotional processes. In fact, in the prefrontal cortex, people that are lonely have been found to have reduced brain's volume on the prefrontal cortex. So socialization enhances your prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is essential for judgment. It's essential for your personality processes, emotional processes, higher cognitive function. And if you have smaller volume of prefrontal cortex, what do you think is going to happen? All these things get affected. So this is a very concerning when the brain is isolated. The other one is the amygdala. And of course, the amygdala is the center for emotional processes in the brain. And they have found, again, in isolated brain, people with isolation, a smaller amygdala. So therefore, their emotional processes is affected. And the hippocampus also have smaller than normal hippocampi and reduced concentration of the brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is the BDNF. BDNF is essential for the healthy well-being of neurons. Without BDNF, you get atrophy, neuronal atrophy. So isolated people will have susceptibility for neuronal atrophy, in particular in structures like the hippocampus that is so important for learning and memory. So as you see, the brain gets impacted by the isolation. And there are other biomarkers that studies have demonstrated that are associated with social isolation. The neuropeptide TAC2 is highly expressed across broad brain regions of the brain. And these are in animal models that when you see animals that have been housed alone for long periods of time compared to controls. Then another studies with social isolation found higher levels of C-reactive protein CRP and fibrinogen that are inflammatory responses. These are biomarkers of inflammation in the brain. And while loneliness associated with lower insulin-like growth factor 1. So isolation and loneliness are a terrible combination for your brain. This is just what I'm trying to convey. It induces inner inflammation. It induces also a lack of regulation of this inflammation. As I showed you before, if you get COVID, in addition to social isolation, what do you think is going to happen? This brain is going to be very much affected, okay? So I will end what time do you have? Okay, I'm going to try to catch up with me to finish with the long COVID, because this is a new situation that has come from the pandemic. And I wanted to show you this video before we go. Let's see if I can. I'm gonna stop sharing and see. Let me know if you see my screen. You see my screen? Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah, we
okay.
can see your screen.
Okay, I'm gonna play this video about the impact of long COVID, and then we'll continue briefly, okay?
Work most of the time, and I can't describe it any better than that. Like the things I used to love doing, I can't do anymore because I don't remember how. I so badly want to be who I was post pre-COVID, and I tried to be that person, and it's just not there.
Rebecca Meyer is one of thousands of coronavirus survivors who are plagued with long-term cognitive health issues associated with COVID-19.
What's really concerning is the vast spectrum of symptoms that fluctuate over time, even neurological and psychological effects.
The severity of these issues and how long they last is still unclear, but that's starting to change. New research shows that the coronavirus may have more wide-ranging effects on the brain than previously thought.
We know that it affects the brain because of some of the symptoms that the patients are reporting. They're reporting memory issues, or they're reporting forgetfulness, they're reporting some brain fog, they're reporting some anxiety, some depression.
Doctors say some patients are also experiencing inattention and symptoms that resemble chronic fatigue syndrome, and that many are reporting them months after initially getting sick.
Patients that oftentimes are in their 20s, 30s, 40s, never had these symptoms before, or if they did, they were mild.
This isn't the first time researchers have seen this. Other viral outbreaks like SARS, MERS, Ebola, H1N1, and the Spanish flu have also caused long-term symptoms related to the nervous system.
We know that from SARS, there were long-term cognitive changes. There are 50 or 100 patients that were able to be followed up, and we saw long-term neuropsychiatric changes, changes in levels of post-exertional fatigue, levels of depression and anxiety, levels of ability to go back to work.
Long-term COVID-19 research is still in its early stages. And right now, scientists still aren't sure how the coronavirus affects neurological functioning. In certain infections, viruses can actually enter the brain. If the brain's immune system reacts, that can lead to swelling, also known as encephalitis. While this can happen with the coronavirus, researchers say it's very rare. Instead, it's more likely that the virus does its damage through an overactive immune response throughout the body. This can also lead to inflammation, which can harm neurons, cells that are essential to cognitive functioning. Here's a closer look at how that happens. The virus that causes COVID-19 usually enters the body through the nose, mouth, or eyes. From there, it can infect the respiratory system, traveling down the trachea to the lungs where it can enter the bloodstream. To fight off this infection, the body sends a flood of immune system cells and molecules known as cytokines. These cause inflammation, which can make it easier for blood to form clots. When these clots build up, they can prevent oxygen from reaching vital organs, including the brain, which can cause cells to die. In the most severe cases, this can lead to strokes. But it's not just the lack of oxygen that can cause damage. Inflammation can also harm the protective barrier that shields the brain, making the organ more vulnerable.
The brain is protected by something we call the blood-brain barrier. And the blood-brain barrier is not really a physical barrier, but it's a biochemical barrier, and it allows certain things to go in. Cells can go in and out, certain nutrients can go in and out.
The blood-brain barrier does a good job of preventing toxins and pathogens from entering the brain. But new research shows that the coronavirus can infect and disrupt the cells that line the barrier walls. This is called the endothelium. This disruption causes the body's immune system to kick further into overdrive, leading to inflammation in the brain.
Imagine a road that is paved by endothelial cells. And along that road, you have immune cells like cars that are rolling along that road. And if a virus or something comes along and destroys that road, the lining, the endothelial cells, and it becomes rough and difficult to ride along, and the immune cells now start bumping along, they become activated and they now start producing all sorts of free radicals and inflammatory factors. That repair process, if it goes on too long, you now have ongoing chronic inflammation. We suspect that that is what happens in the ongoing process of long haulers.
And this isn't the only way that inflammation can attack the nervous system. Cells supporting the olfactory neurons in the nose can also be damaged by the infection. Scientists suspect that when these cells die, patients might experience a loss of taste and smell. Research from other infections shows that inflammatory signals can make their way up nerves into the brain, causing even more inflammation. These are some of the ways that scientists think inflammation can affect the nervous system, and they could explain why so many long-haul patients are experiencing neurological problems. So what does this mean for those with persisting symptoms? Past epidemics offer some clues. Researchers studying the 1918 Spanish flu found that a number of survivors showed symptoms related to Parkinson's decades later. More recently, physicians have reported tremors in a few COVID-19 patients, but much of the research is still in animals.
It may range from some effects that are temporary to some that may be permanent, including loss of certain circuits that may not come back. And those may be associated with things like dementia or motor symptoms, things like Parkinsonism, things like Alzheimer's and other dementias.
But this idea is preliminary.
It's a prediction based on past events where we know that viruses that affect the brain directly or indirectly may have effects. And so we'll have to see. It'll be a matter of time and trying to test it.
Even so, scientists say these findings are an important step forward, and that the research could help find answers, not just for COVID-19 patients, but for those with other brain diseases too.
One reason to hope is that I also have seen patients who have recovered within weeks to months. People who may have responded well to some treatment for some underlying associated brain fog symptoms. It seems that the underlying cognitive dysfunction has been improving without any strong immunomodulatory drugs, for example. That said, the jury is still out.
Hopefully, these issues that I'm having and other people, it's not lifelong. That's what we're hoping. It feels like it is right now. It feels like.
But now I'll go back to my presentation. That is somewhere here. And now? Yes. Okay. So the symptoms, if you look at what it happens with the long COVID, look at all the things individuals have to suffer. It's just a lot. And so because it affects basically the whole body. I mean, I tried to see, okay, it's only for this. No, it's everything. It's fatigue, it's malaise, it's anxiety, it's pulmonary, endocrine, the works. So long COVID is a major condition that we still have to understand and what's going on. And for the CDC, found that close to 2/3 of Americans who tested positive reported at least one long-term symptoms more than 4 months after being infected. And 55.5 included cognitive dysfunction, like difficulty concentrating or memory loss. So long COVID is a reality. We need to address it. And that is a problem right now for patients that require treatment. And the problem is that the health insurance won't cover. For example, if you say I have long COVID at your job, they say, well, tough luck, you have to come back with long COVID, with all those things I just mentioned to you. So this is a major problem because the healthcare system is not prepared for it. There's no real treatment for it. It is a very concerning situation, okay? And then, you know, these are also just to remind you of what we just discussed about how the brain is very much affected by COVID and the areas of the brain that are related to a lot of the neuropsychiatric effects. And I wanted to also quote you with very recent data that just got published. This was just published in March. And for example, that shows rapid vigilance and episodic memory decrements on COVID survivors. And these are healthy patients, and the red line is COVID survivors about accuracy in attention. So we're having attention deficits, significant attention deficits for these patients. And also other cognitive effects deficits have been found in another recently published paper. Finally, another important thing is about permanent damage of COVID. And this just recently, this is the first longitudinal imaging study of SARS-CoV on participants where they initially scanned before and after they were infected. And as you can see, found evidence of an average decline on overall size of the brain following COVID. And the scan shows significant tissue damage in areas of the brain related to smell and gray matter parts linked to smell and memory, which are these areas that you see in red. That include the orbitofrontal cortex, the parahippocampal gyrus, and the primary olfactory cortex. All three areas were affected by COVID. So, and these are just to remind you about all these effects that the neuroinflammation has on it. So, and this is to remind me of all what I just told you. So treatment for long COVID right now is very difficult because of the multiple diagnostic fronts. So these are matters that the medical community is trying to address. And as you saw in the video, there's some clues from previous pandemic data, but COVID is a special one. So we'll have to wait to see how we manage. It's only been 2.5 years since this thing started. So with that, I want to stop here and thank you for being here, coming to this series. And I'm open to questions or comments. And then we will finish. So any questions or comments from Juval or girls here? No? So your question, Andrea, of how long this lasts, well, I hope I tried to answer it. So it all depends on how all the other risk factors that can affect, can make it you more vulnerable. In this study of the effect on the brain, they looked at asymptomatic, mild, and severe. And in the asymptomatic, they saw some mild effect, but basically is they could not separate them from mild. So even if you're asymptomatic, you can get deficits in cognition because the virus is in your brain. So even though you don't have symptoms, that doesn't mean that the virus cannot affect you. But the most severe ones, obviously the ones that really get very sick, those are the most susceptible to that. So yeah.
I have a question.
Uh-huh. Yes.
So I know you mentioned that there isn't really much of a treatment plan for long COVID, but in terms of things that we as individuals can proactively do you think there's anything we can do to like alleviate symptoms like that or to prevent it going forward?
Well, what I have, and this is more, I mean, I search for new treatments, and the thing is that, well, is that it's so broad that you cannot say, okay, you take this and this drug and then everything will be, better. How to be more of a preventive kind of thing? Most definitely, as I mentioned to you, since all these other societal factors can exacerbate the infection, social isolation, lack of exercise, lack of good nutrition. Therefore, just to keep a very healthy diet, be mindful of the viruses around you. And once, if you have it, you know that your brain and your pulmonary system and your cardiovascular system is going to be affected. So the cardiologist and the neurologist, they're all going to bring you medication perhaps to deal with the symptomatology. But I think that there's a lot to do with how you approach the condition, how you see the condition as something that you have to, participate in the process of feeling better. So there's a lot of mental and attitude toward trying to treat it in a way that is more efficient for each one of us. But having said that, it all has to do with access of resources of healthcare, of scenarios where you can, be mindful of your body, mindful of your mental health. And those things sometimes you don't have accessible. So even though you have more, all the intentions in the world, but if that is not accessible, then it's very hard for you to achieve that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Sure.
Very true.
Another comment from Andrea.
So would the effects be worsened because of the effects that the isolation and depression are causing?
Yes.
So people are getting COVID after all of this, probably more susceptible to those symptoms as well.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, because when it impacts your mental health and you're anxious and depressed, that it has known that induces stress response. So your body's as in the highest stress, and stress is detrimental to your immune system. So it's going to also not help you get well. So you need to take care of your mental health in order to take care of your physical health. And that part is always hard because there's a lot of stigma about it, you're just, you're just being, not strong enough, you need to take care. But and then if it depends on your situation, if you're a mother of 4 that you have to work and help them at school, and then your husband is not there because he has to go out to work and he doesn't have time to be with you and helping with it. I mean, it is a very complex situation. And so that's why COVID has brought up as a society, in particular, the challenges that the new family of the 21st century faces, depending on, like I mentioned at the beginning, how much access you have for resources and healthcare. Because if you don't have any of this access, you are very much vulnerable to getting really sick and die. I mean, in Puerto Rico, we have over 4,000 people have died of COVID as of yesterday. And for a small island, I think that's a lot. And so, and we still have a very high positivity rate. We used to had a 9% positivity rate in January. And that changed completely because of our behaviors as well. And people are still dying of COVID in Puerto Rico, at least 4 persons a day. I mean, as long as people are dying of COVID and people now with long COVID, imagine how long would that take, you know? So it's good to see how we can, I mean, I show you the data, but at the same time, we should be mindful of what should we do about it? How can we improve? But just like Yuval was mentioning, how can I fix this problem? You know? So, any comments or other questions? No? Okay. Well, this was today's first series. We'll have a next one, not this Monday, the last Monday of the month. And so we'll see you then. Thank you, Yuval, for joining us. I really appreciate that.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a very important seminar. I'm very glad
I'm glad you liked it. I'm glad you liked it, and I looking forward to seeing you later in the future ones. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
You
Have a
take
good
care.
day.
You too. Bueno, gracias, chicas. We'll finish now.